Welcome to Black Truth, where history's forgotten horrors breathe again and some family legacies refuse to die. Tonight, we journey into a tale so unsettling, so deeply unnatural, that it will challenge everything you believe about death, devotion, and what lingers in between. This is the story of a family that never buried their dead, a family that may still be out there, moving stiffly through the night. It all began in the late 1700s, deep in the pine-wrapped highlands of New Hampshire, where the mountain fog creeps low and the trees seem to listen. That's where the Hargrave family appeared, quietly, without fanfare. They purchased a hilltop estate overlooking the isolated town of Cold Hollow, and from the moment they arrived, the whispers started. The patriarch, Augustus Hargrave, was a reclusive man with cold eyes and ideas that unsettled even the most open-minded of the townsfolk. He came with his wife Eleanor and their 3 children, Jonathan, Caroline, and little Samuel, after a hasty departure from Boston following rumors of improper scientific pursuits. There were tales of unsanctioned experiments, violations of natural law, and something about cadavers that no one dared repeat aloud. Cold Hollow was a place that still clung to its Puritan roots, where the church bell tolled for every soul lost, and burial was a sacred rite. So when the Hargraves settled into what the locals called Ravenwood Manor, a grim stone mansion that loomed over the valley like a watchful eye, the town waited nervously for what would come next. At first, their oddness could be chalked up to eccentricity. They rarely visited town, declined all invitations to Sunday service, and hired no local help despite the manor's vast size. Eleanor was occasionally seen tending to the withering rose garden, and Jonathan sometimes came into town for supplies, but always alone, always silent. Then came the winter of 1798, when Eleanor fell gravely ill. A fever swept through the hills, taking many, but none left a mark quite like Eleanor's passing. Dr. James Alcott was summoned in the dead of night. He would later recount the scene with haunted eyes, Eleanor lying motionless in a lace-trimmed gown, her skin already growing pale. Augustus stood beside her, his expression unreadable. "I fear we're too late," Dr. Alcott murmured, reaching for his bag. But Augustus didn't flinch. "No arrangements," he said flatly, eyes fixed on the window beyond. "She stays with us. The Hargraves do not bury their dead." Dr. Alcott was speechless. He explained as delicately as he could the importance of proper burial, both for health and for the soul. But Augustus only narrowed his eyes. "To bury her would be to lose her," he said, "and I won't allow that." The doctor left in a state of deep unease. The next day, he returned with Reverend Mitchell, hoping to persuade the grieving family to reconsider. But what they found was something neither man could ever forget. Through a gap in the manor's heavy wooden doors, they saw Eleanor. She was seated upright at the dining table, dressed in her Sunday best, her eyes closed as if merely napping. Around her, the family sat in silence, plates arranged as if awaiting dinner. Augustus turned slowly, his voice calm and eerie. "She belongs here. Death is just a pause, Reverend, not a farewell." Word spread through Cold Hollow like wildfire. The Hargraves weren't just strange, they were dangerous. Fear took root. Children were warned never to go near the manor. Some claimed they saw candlelight flickering in Eleanor's room late into the night. Others swore they heard music drifting down the hill, haunting, incomplete melodies, like someone playing a lullaby with lifeless fingers. And still, Augustus lived as though nothing had changed. From that moment on, the Hargraves were no longer viewed as merely strange. They were seen as something unholy. Cold Hollow, already a place wrapped in superstition and old fears, now whispered of black magic and blasphemy. Some believed Augustus had made a pact with forces that should never be named. Others thought he'd simply lost his mind. But what everyone agreed upon was this: something in that house wasn't right. Sheriff Henry Dalton, the county's aging lawman, climbed the hill one bitter morning in February, hoping to talk sense into Augustus. When he knocked, the door opened just enough to let him in. The manor was colder inside than out, the air thick with the scent of herbs, wax, and something else. Something sweet and spoiled. Eleanor was there, still seated in her chair by the fireplace, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression was peaceful, but her skin had taken on a waxen sheen. "She's part of the family," Augustus said flatly. "Her presence comforts the children." Dalton didn't know what to say. There was no law in New Hampshire that explicitly prohibited keeping the deceased within your own home, provided there was no threat to public health. But the sheriff left Ravenwood unsettled and issued a quiet warning to the townspeople. Avoid the manor. Let sleeping devils lie. The children, it seemed, had begun to internalize their father's beliefs. Jonathan, now 17, would speak softly to his mother's still form. Caroline, only 13, would brush Eleanor's hair and sing lullabies as if trying to soothe a restless spirit. And little Samuel, just 8, asked visitors when his mama would wake up and make pancakes again. The lines between the living and the dead were fading fast in that house. And then, as though fate had not yet finished with the Hargraves, another tragedy struck. In October of 1800, Jonathan ventured out into the forest for a morning hunt. The woods around Ravenwood were dense and gnarled, and few entered them alone. But Jonathan had grown up in those woods. He knew every tree, every turn, which made what happened all the more troubling. The gunshot echoed down the valley, sharp and sudden. Hours passed before Augustus emerged from the trees, carrying Jonathan's limp body in his arms, eyes glassy with something between grief and grim purpose. He never explained what had gone wrong, only that his son's rifle had misfired. But no funeral was arranged. No grave was dug. Instead, Jonathan joined Eleanor. Visitors who were reluctantly allowed inside the manor in the following months reported seeing the boy's stiff body sitting upright in his old armchair, a leather-bound book resting in his frozen hands. His eyes had been carefully closed, his expression oddly serene. The two corpses, mother and son, now shared the parlor with the living, like cherished guests who had simply chosen not to speak. The villagers, horrified, demanded action, but with no law being technically broken and no signs of illness or decay spilling into the community, there was little the authorities could do. And so the Hargraves were left alone, surrounded by rumors and an ever-growing sense of dread. Late at night, strange lights flickered behind Ravenwood's high windows. Shadows moved when no one should have been awake. Some swore they heard chanting, low, rhythmic, unnatural. One shepherd claimed he saw a figure on the hill moving like it didn't remember how limbs were supposed to work. No one went up there anymore, not even during the day, yet strangely, not everyone stayed away. A few townsfolk, driven by grief, curiosity, or something darker, began visiting the Hargraves. Augustus welcomed them. He spoke to them of death not as an ending but as a door he believed could swing both ways, and for some, his words made a terrible kind of sense. The first to be drawn into Augustus Hargrave's web was a young widow named Margaret Bell. Her husband had died of tuberculosis the previous winter, and she never seemed to recover from the loss. When she heard whispers that Augustus had found a way to keep his loved ones close, truly close, something inside her cracked. She arrived at Ravenwood in the spring of 1801 and never truly left. Margaret became a frequent visitor, eventually spending entire nights at the manor. According to her own writings, found years later beneath the floorboards of an abandoned room in her family's old home, Augustus was not just a madman, he was a visionary. He spoke with conviction, with calm authority. He believed that the soul didn't flee the body at the moment of death. It lingered, tethered to the vessel it once animated, and could be preserved, sustained, perhaps even reawakened, if the right balance of chemistry and devotion was applied. Margaret described the manor's interior in harrowing detail. The deceased were arranged not in coffins or shadowy corners, but in full view as participants in everyday life. Eleanor's hands now held a piece of embroidery forever in progress. Jonathan sat with his book, as if mid-thought, and yet it was the living who unsettled her most. Carolyn would read aloud to her mother's unblinking face. Samuel played near Jonathan's unmoving feet. To them, this was not grotesque. It was normal. It was home. Margaret's writings took a darker turn as time passed. She spoke of dreams she couldn't escape, of long hallways filled with whispering voices, of waking to find herself standing in parts of the manor she didn't remember walking to. Her entries became increasingly fragmented, filled with phrases like, "The threshold is thin," and "I heard Eleanor breathe." Still, she returned, again and again. By 1802, others began to visit, drawn by Augustus's growing reputation as a man who had conquered death, or at least subdued it. These weren't grieving widows anymore. They were seekers, men and women obsessed with ancient texts, forbidden rituals, and the promise of defying the finality of the grave. Ravenwood became a secretive haven for those who dared to ask questions no sane person should. Augustus had transformed one wing of the manor into what he called his laboratory. There, surrounded by rows of yellowing books and countless glass vials, he conducted his work. Margaret wrote of strange smells, humming machines, and bodies that didn't rot the way they should. She claimed Augustus had discovered a method of embalming so advanced, so unnatural, that it not only halted decay, it preserved a type of biological potential. But not everything was as perfect as it seemed. She noted changes in Augustus. He slept less, ate little, spoke more often to the dead than to the living. Sometimes she caught him muttering in languages she couldn't recognize. Other times, he simply stood before Eleanor for hours, whispering as if pleading for something she refused to give. Margaret feared he was beginning to cross lines even he had once respected. In the winter of 1803, Cold Hollow was hit by one of the harshest snowstorms in living memory. Roads vanished, supplies dwindled, illness crept from house to house like a shadow, and in the midst of this hardship, 3 local children vanished during a blizzard. Search parties were formed, but the storm hampered every effort. Tracks disappeared in the snow, and panic gripped the town. On the 4th day, a group of men followed a hunch, one born of whispered fears and long-avoided truths. They trudged up the hill to Ravenwood Manor. What they found behind the manor changed everything. Buried beneath the snow, half hidden among the pines, was a stone building no one had seen before. It had no windows, only a rusted iron door, heavy and bolted. From within, a smell unlike anything they'd ever known leaked into the cold air, something between rot and chemicals. And beneath that, something else. Movement. Sound. Not human. Not animal. Something in between. The iron door groaned open under the weight of their fear and frozen resolve. Sheriff Dalton led the group inside, lantern raised high. The dim light flickered against stone walls, streaked with rust, or something darker. What lay before them wasn't a cellar, nor a workshop. It was a chamber, a secret one, carved deep into the hillside. The room was cold, but not with the chill of winter. It was the sterile cold of preserved things. 6 metal tables stood in 2 rows. On each one, a body lay in various states of grotesque reconstruction. Not simple preservation like with Eleanor and Jonathan, but something worse. Bodies sewn together from parts that didn't belong to the same person. Limbs mismatched, skin stretched unnaturally, and eyes glassy with something far removed from sleep. Some of them twitched, a hand flexed, a head jerked. The screams from the search party echoed into the trees. In the far corner of the chamber, huddled behind a curtain of burlap, were the partially disassembled remains of the missing children. The faces were barely recognizable, but the townsfolk knew the sorrow would come later. For now, Only horror remained. They dragged Augustus from the manor, his expression unreadable. He offered no resistance, no excuses. Margaret was found beside one of the metal tables, her hands slick with whatever dark alchemy she'd helped unleash. She wept when they took her, but never spoke a word. Caroline and Samuel were discovered in the upper rooms of the house. They were thin, pale, and dazed, as if they'd been sleepwalking for months. The town took them in, unsure whether they were victims, collaborators, or something worse. Back at Ravenwood, the search intensified. What investigators found only deepened the nightmare. The preserved bodies of Eleanor and Jonathan were no longer in the parlor. Their chairs sat empty, no trace of where they had gone. But they had not been discarded. Of that, the sheriff was certain. Upstairs, in a locked room, they found 7 more bodies, arranged in tableaux that mimicked domestic scenes. A tea party, frozen in time. A music lesson for invisible students, all lifeless, all grotesquely intact. In Augustus's laboratory, they uncovered his journals. Volumes upon volumes, filled with precise handwriting, chemical formulas, diagrams of human anatomy, and chilling personal reflections. He called it the work. In those pages, he described death not as an end, but a challenge, a puzzle that required only persistence and the right tools to solve. He believed the soul could be anchored, that consciousness might be coaxed back. His final notes hinted at something he called the threshold procedure, an experiment meant to restore full awareness to the preserved. Whether it had worked, no one could say. The trial of Augustus Hargrave and Margaret Bell was swift and sealed. The charges were as undefined as the crimes: desecration, unlawful experimentation, murder. None seemed to capture the full monstrosity of what had occurred. Both were sentenced to death, but on the morning of their execution, their cells were found empty. No broken locks, no signs of escape. The guards swore no one had entered or left. The only clue was the faint scent of embalming chemicals clinging to the bars and walls. Ravenwood was searched again, but the house was empty. The only signs of recent activity were the dragged impressions of something heavy across the floorboards, leading toward the woods. 3 days later, a shepherd claimed he saw 5 figures walking through the early morning mist. A tall man, a woman, 2 children, and a young boy with unnatural stillness in his gait. They moved with stiff precision, disappearing into the trees. The town of Cold Hollow never recovered. Ravenwood Manor was abandoned. No one would purchase the land. Over time, the forest took it back. Stones crumbled. Vines devoured the gate. But the memory of the Hargraves never faded, and neither did the fear. Decades passed, but the legend of the Hargraves never truly died. Cold Hollow remained haunted by the memory of what had taken root in Ravenwood Manor. Children dared each other to climb the hill, but rarely made it past the rusted gate. Those who did swore they felt watched, eyes unseen, breathless shadows moving just behind the trees. By the mid-19th century, the tale had become folklore, the kind whispered at night when the wind moaned and the fire dimmed. But then came a story from across the sea. In 1837, a small village in northern France reported a strange new family living on its outskirts. They called themselves the Holstons, 5 of them, just as the shepherd in Cold Hollow had described. The village doctor was summoned one rainy afternoon. An elderly woman had fallen ill, or so he was told. But when he arrived, what he found chilled him. The woman was already dead, her skin pale and waxy, her limbs unnaturally rigid. Yet her family insisted she was only sleeping. They refused to allow the doctor to examine her closely. More disturbing still, the patriarch of the family spoke in heavily accented English and moved as if each joint required conscious effort to operate. When local authorities returned days later to investigate, the Holstons had vanished. Their home was left abandoned, but not empty. A lingering chemical smell clung to the rooms. Glass jars filled with unidentified fluids lined the shelves, and in a closet near the back, someone had left a pair of child-sized shoes, one of them still warm. From that moment on, stories began surfacing throughout Europe. In villages across Germany, Austria, even as far east as Romania, accounts emerged of a family with the same pattern. 5 members, stiff in movement, deeply private, never seen attending funerals. In each case, they vanished without warning, always leaving behind signs that something unnatural had lived among them. Some said they were scientists, others claimed they were spirits, or worse, reanimated husks animated by forgotten rites. But among those obsessed with the occult, one name kept resurfacing: Augustus Hargrave. They believed he had succeeded, that his threshold procedure had worked, that he had preserved not only the bodies of his loved ones, but their consciousness, or at least enough of it to keep them functioning. His writings had spread like a virus, shared among secret circles, fascinated by death's boundary and how it might be breached. By 1904, these rumors reached a private investigator named Richard Langley, hired to look into a secluded family living in the Carpathian Mountains. His client, a wealthy American industrialist, feared his daughter had become entangled with a strange young man from the reclusive estate. Langley traveled to the region under the guise of a surveyor and spent weeks gathering information. What he found shocked even him. The family consisted of 5 individuals: a stern man who rarely spoke, a woman who never moved from her rocking chair, 2 quiet children, and a teenage boy who always seemed just slightly off. Langley noted that the woman's eyes were glass, perfectly round, without depth. He never once saw her blink. When he attempted to photograph them, he was discovered and beaten badly. But he managed to escape, and in his report, later discovered among his personal effects, he wrote, "If these are not the Hargraves, they are certainly their legacy. I have never encountered a presence so cold, so wrong. The air around them did not breathe. It simply waited." After Langley's return, the estate in the Carpathians was found abandoned. No trace of the family remained. But villagers claimed they had seen 5 figures walking toward the horizon in the early morning mist. Slowly, deliberately, always together. Langley's report circulated quietly among academic circles and fringe researchers. It became a kind of forbidden text, whispered about in universities and occult study groups, but never published openly. The implications were too disturbing. If true, it suggested that Augustus Hargrave and his family had not only survived, but had continued their unnatural existence for over a century. Then, in 1923, another unsettling clue emerged. A dilapidated farmhouse outside Prague was purchased by a reclusive gentleman who paid in cash and used a false name. Locals took little notice, except to say that the new occupants rarely ventured outside. But those who passed by claimed to see strange figures moving behind the curtains. Always the same number. Always the same stiffness. During renovations nearly 2 decades later, workers uncovered something hidden behind a false wall in the cellar. A collection of leather-bound journals and crumbling documents, all written in archaic English. The handwriting matched samples believed to be Augustus's. The contents of the journals mirrored his known experiments, describing preservation techniques, soul tethering procedures, and chilling observations about what he called partial resurrection. Most disturbing of all was a photograph folded into the back of one of the books. Faded and curling at the edges, it showed 5 people posed stiffly in front of a crumbling stone house. A man, a woman, 2 children, and a boy on the verge of adolescence. They wore clothing from the late Victorian era, but experts who analyzed the photo insisted the paper and process suggested a much later date, possibly the 1930s or 40s. Every detail of the image was wrong. Their eyes were too still, their posture too perfect. The woman's pupils reflected no light, and the man's left hand appeared to be stitched at the wrist, the seams barely visible but unmistakably there. The photograph was acquired by a private collector before authorities could take possession. It hasn't been seen since. Throughout the 20th century, stories of the Hargrave-like family continued to surface. Urban legends in rural Romania spoke of the Walking Ones, a family who lived deep in the woods, never aged, and never buried their own. In the Bavarian Alps, a retired nurse claimed she had been hired to care for a mute elderly woman who never blinked and whose skin felt like polished leather. And in the Louisiana Bayou during the 1950s, several hunters told of encountering a strange group in the swamp, 5 figures in outdated clothing who stared silently as they passed, unmoving until the hunters left the clearing. Each account shared the same chilling details: a tall, stiff man, a woman who did not speak, 2 silent children, and a boy who never seemed to grow. In 1982, a university in upstate New York received a package with no return address. Inside was a stack of handwritten pages and an old map marked with a crude drawing of what resembled Ravenwood Manor. The text appeared to be a partial translation of Augustus's writings, specifically focused on something called the reanimation window. The manuscript proposed that there was a precise period, just days after clinical death, when the human body could be chemically stabilized and its spiritual tether maintained. The document warned of threshold degradation and described side effects that included behavioral decay, memory loss, and eventual collapse of mobility. But more disturbingly, it implied that some subjects, if treated repeatedly over time, could be kept in a suspended state indefinitely. That same year, a fire broke out in a remote cabin in Oregon. Firefighters discovered a room in the basement lined with tables, bottles of preservatives, and several mannequins posed as if in mid-conversation. Only they weren't mannequins, they were people, preserved, silent, waiting, and once again, 5 of them. Authorities labeled the Oregon discovery a case of extreme mental illness. The bodies were catalogued, examined, and quietly buried. Official reports made no mention of their preservation state, nor the condition of the chemicals found beside them. But a coroner's assistant, who later vanished under mysterious circumstances, had told a colleague that none of the corpses showed typical signs of decay, even those estimated to be over 70 years old. Among the remains was a journal, badly damaged, scorched at the edges, but partially legible. It was written in a woman's hand and signed only with the letter C. The entries were haunting, disjointed fragments describing the stiffening, father's serum, and dreams filled with muffled screams beneath the floorboards. One passage stood out. Father says we must move again. The neighbors have begun asking why mother never steps outside. William caused a scene yesterday. He wandered into the village square. His movements are less controlled now. People stared. Another entry, more recent, hinted at something even darker. Thomas is the worst now. His arm won't lift. The new formula isn't working. Father has begun to prepare a room for me. He says I'll need it soon. No identities were confirmed, but for those who had studied the Hargrave legacy, there was little doubt who C. William and Thomas really were. Years passed. The story slipped again into obscurity. Then came the fire in rural Maine. It was 2010 when the farmhouse went up in flames. At first, it seemed like an accident, a faulty wire, maybe lightning. But what investigators found in the aftermath turned it into one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in state history. Hidden beneath the charred remains of the house was a reinforced cellar sealed with steel doors. Inside were 10 preserved bodies in various states of decomposition. Most were badly damaged by the fire, but 5 remained largely intact, arranged around a dinner table, seated as though frozen mid-conversation. Once again, a man, a woman, 2 children, and an adolescent boy. Chemical analysis revealed unidentifiable compounds in their tissue. Whatever process had preserved them had kept internal structures intact far longer than medical science deemed possible. And yet, forensic specialists noted that some of the more recently deceased had likely been alive when the preservation began. That revelation sent a shudder through every department involved in the case. The property had been purchased 20 years earlier under a false name. The neighbors knew almost nothing. The family kept to themselves. Mail was never picked up at the box. Deliveries were rare. When someone did catch a glimpse through a window, they always described the same thing: 5 people sitting motionless, eyes unfocused, watching nothing, or perhaps listening to something the world couldn't hear. Among the personal effects recovered from the site was another journal, mostly intact, hidden in a metal box beneath the floor. This one bore a full name on the inside cover: Charlotte Hargrave. It was dated 1847. She wrote of her father's obsession of a new land where they wouldn't be hunted. She wrote of long, sleepless nights, of her brother's deteriorating coordination, of stitching and powder and blood that wouldn't stop seeping through linen no matter how tightly it was wrapped. But most chilling was the final entry: I fear Father is preserving us while we still breathe. I feel it in my hands each morning, the stiffness, the silence inside. I don't know how much longer I'll be me. I saw him last night standing over my bed. The syringe was full. He whispered, "It's time." The journal was authenticated. The ink, the paper, the language, all consistent with the mid-19th century. But how it ended up beneath a house that burned in 2010 remains unexplained. And so the question rose again. Had the Hargraves ever truly died? Or had they simply perfected the art of staying behind? The discovery of Charlotte Hargrave's journal reignited global interest in the family's dark legend. Scholars, paranormal investigators, and amateur researchers began tracing every rumor, every unconfirmed sighting of the 5 motionless figures. For decades, their presence had flickered like static across history, never confirmed, never fully dismissed. A few brave souls attempted to compile what they called the Hargrave pattern, an eerie blueprint of timelines, migrations, and disappearances. The pattern suggested that wherever the Hargraves appeared, they remained no longer than a generation. Then came the inevitable whispers, the unease, the vanishing, and always they left behind something. A trace of chemicals, a sealed room, a corpse that shouldn't have looked so intact. But perhaps the most disturbing theory came from Dr. Edwin Chalmers, a biochemist turned folklore analyst. He proposed that Augustus Hargrave had not merely preserved his family post-mortem. He had learned to administer his preservation technique before death. According to Chalmers, this would have created a twilight existence, a body chemically arrested, a mind partially intact, and a soul anchored somewhere between worlds. The horror wasn't just that the Hargraves refused to bury their dead. It was that they might never have allowed their loved ones to die in the first place. And if that was true, then by the early 2000s, the family would have been enduring this halfway state for over 2 centuries. In 2018, local authorities in a remote town in Eastern Europe stumbled across a case that echoed everything from Cold Hollow to the Oregon cellar. An elderly couple had died in a house fire, and firefighters discovered 7 bodies posed around the home. All were family members, children, grandchildren, preserved in rooms staged like frozen scenes of daily life. A child reading to an unblinking sibling. A teenager seated at a piano, her fingers forever frozen above the keys. When questioned, a surviving relative said something that made the lead investigator freeze. "We learned it from a traveler," she said. "He came to our village many years ago. Spoke softly, carried a journal. He said his family had found a way not to lose each other." Further inquiries led nowhere. The house was demolished. The surviving relative disappeared within months. But among the photographs taken at the scene was one detail that experts kept returning to: A bookshelf, largely intact despite the flames, lined with jars filled with pale powder and faded labels in English. Some were marked retainer formula, others simply tether. One was labeled Threshold B. The connection was undeniable. It was around this time that a private collector, long believed to have held some of Augustus's original journals, emerged in an online interview under heavy anonymity. He claimed the Hargraves' methods were not supernatural, but biochemical, frighteningly plausible when applied with enough precision and disregard for ethics. He referred to their process as stabilized consciousness preservation. According to him, the technique had advanced past death. The Hargraves had begun using it proactively, treating one another before any illness or age could interfere. What this meant was unthinkable, that Charlotte's fears had come true. They were not dead, they were simply suspended. Bodies intact, brains slowed, dimmed but not extinguished, held in a state just outside death, forever waiting, responding only to routine, habit, or command. Like marionettes whose strings hadn't yet been cut, and still they moved. Some believe the Hargraves now traveled as a closed unit, relying on forged identities, off-grid cash transactions, and isolation. Each time they were nearly discovered, they vanished, leaving behind another scene, another warning, another silence that could not be explained. Others believed they no longer moved on their own, that whatever spark Augustus had used to keep them functional had begun to fade, and that someone, somewhere, was helping them continue. The idea that someone was actively aiding the Hargraves, that the family had acquired a caretaker or even a disciple, shook the community of researchers who had tracked their story for years. If the serum's effectiveness was waning and the family's bodies required maintenance, then someone had taken up Augustus's role. Someone living, someone willing. But who? That question led investigators down new paths. In 2020, a university researcher in Budapest uncovered shipping records tied to obscure medical supply companies. There had been recurring bulk orders of preservation agents, formaldehyde derivatives, and synthetic stabilizers, all delivered to false identities, all routed through increasingly remote destinations. The destinations shared one commonality: isolation. One such order led to a derelict farmhouse in the outskirts of Pennsylvania. By the time authorities arrived, the property had been abandoned. Inside, they found 5 reclining chairs in a half-circle, each with restraints on the arms and IV lines still dangling from rusted hooks above. No bodies, no blood. Just the lingering, sour, sweet scent of antiseptics and decay. On a nearby table lay a single note. Written in the same delicate, archaic script found in earlier Hargrave journals. It read, "The ritual falters, the body resists, the tether frays, we must relocate." Beneath the note was a faded family photograph. It was decades old, but not ancient. A stern man, a glassy-eyed woman, 2 children and a boy caught mid-blink. The image bore no date, no names, but the arrangement was unmistakable. What was most unsettling wasn't the photo itself. It was the presence of a 6th figure. A young man, maybe in his 30s, standing just behind them, half in shadow. His expression was neither blank nor fearful. He looked proud. Researchers began calling him the Keeper. They believed he was the latest in a long line of assistants or apprentices. Perhaps Margaret Bell had not been the only one drawn in by Augustus's charisma. Perhaps, across generations, others had taken up the mantle, drawn by grief or obsession or the promise of defeating death. The Keeper, it seemed, was different. He wasn't just helping them survive, he was perfecting the process. In late 2021, a chilling report surfaced out of northern Idaho. A park ranger found an unregistered cabin deep within the national forest, miles from any trail. The structure was modern, fortified, and wired with a crude electrical setup powered by solar panels. Inside were 5 beds, 5 sets of clothing, 5 sets of personal belongings arranged neatly, untouched by time. There were notebooks everywhere, meticulous logs detailing feeding routines, chemical dosages, physical limitations, and something called cognitive response drift. These notes were clinical, detached, and deeply disturbing. One entry read, Day 422. Caroline's jaws locking again, muscle resistance increasing, vocalization minimal, will adjust solution. Another read, Samuel attempted to move unprompted, coordination failure, collapsed, monitored for 36 hours, no activity, re-injected, restored limited function. Beneath one of the beds was a locked metal box. Inside, law enforcement found photographs, vials of the preservation serum, and a sealed envelope containing a handwritten letter addressed simply to whom it may concern. The letter was signed A. Hargrave, 3rd generation. It was the first concrete evidence that the Hargrave legacy had passed beyond the original 5. If true, the keeper wasn't a stranger drawn in by horror or desperation. He was family, born of them, trained by them, and now he was continuing the work. The implication was staggering. It meant the Hargraves hadn't just survived. They had adapted, they had multiplied, and they had begun something far more disturbing than preservation. They were building lineage, and wherever they were going next, it wasn't just to hide, it was to expand. The realization that the Hargraves had not only survived but reproduced shattered the fragile line between myth and history. If Augustus's descendants had inherited not just his bloodline but his obsession, his methods, then the story wasn't just about one family's refusal to die. It was about an ideology, a legacy of engineered immortality spreading like a hidden contagion. That fall, whispers began surfacing in a quiet suburb outside St. Louis. A new family had moved into an aging colonial home at the end of a cul-de-sac. They kept to themselves, never hosted gatherings, refused neighborhood invitations. But the strangest part wasn't their reclusive nature. It was how still they were. A mail carrier reported that the family never answered the door, even for express deliveries. A landscaping crew claimed they saw 5 people sitting on the back porch in absolute silence, not moving, not blinking. When they returned the following week, the same figures were in different positions, but with the same unsettling stillness, like mannequins rearranged for display. A neighbor, curious and unnerved, walked over one evening just before dusk. She approached the porch and said hello. No response. She stepped closer, heart pounding, and noticed something wrong with the woman's hands. Too pale, too smooth, with the texture of wax. Before she could look closer, the screen door creaked open behind her. A man stood in the doorway. Not old, not young. His voice was calm, polite, and strangely formal. "Please don't disturb them," he said. "They're resting." She backed away slowly, nodded, and left without another word. That night, her dog refused to stop barking at their side of the fence. Within weeks, the family was gone. The house stood empty. The neighbors never learned their names. But one of the children later claimed to have seen a man hauling 5 large containers into a covered truck just before dawn, each shaped roughly like a seated body. Law enforcement found the house scrubbed clean. No fingerprints, no DNA, but they did find a basement lined with cooling equipment and a reinforced chamber that had recently held liquid tanks. One wall had been painted over. Beneath the paint, forensic techs uncovered a phrase written in what appeared to be faded brown ink. The body must not fail. The bond must not break. Family is the vessel, forever. That same month, a truck stop surveillance camera in Iowa caught a blurry image of what appeared to be the same man. Now driving west, the same covered truck trailing behind him. Highway patrol was alerted. The truck was never found. Then came the incident in Oregon's Cascade Mountains. a group of hikers stumbled upon what they initially thought was an abandoned military bunker. Its entrance was buried beneath moss and earth, camouflaged from aerial view. The inside was unnaturally cold, though no working generator was found. 5 cots were set up against one wall. 4 showed deep impressions. 1 was spotless. Across the room stood a strange device, an old operating table refitted with modern restraints, surrounded by IV drips, clamps, and syringes, labeled in the same faded script seen in earlier discoveries. On the table was a notebook, not a journal, a ledger. Inside were names, dates, conditions. Each entry appeared to document preservation cycles, serum modifications, and side effects. At the very bottom of the last page was a note written in a different hand. She is ready. The next generation begins with her. The implication was inescapable. They weren't just maintaining the old bodies anymore. They were creating new ones, preparing the young for a future where death would be delayed indefinitely, and where the rituals of life were no longer sacred, but procedural. And always, it was the same 5. Again and again, a family that refused to die. If the Hargraves had begun replicating their existence, then their legacy was no longer confined to a single bloodline. It had become a doctrine, a ritual passed down, perfected, and reimagined across generations. Preservation was no longer just about love or loss. It was about control, about sculpting eternity from flesh. In the spring of 2022, a whistleblower from a defunct private biotech firm in Northern California released a series of encrypted documents onto a hidden server. Within the files were procurement records for rare embalming agents, orders for industrial refrigeration units, and encrypted lab notes referencing something called the Samaritan Protocol. The notes were disturbingly familiar. Mentions of tether windows, cognitive tapering, and pre-threshold stabilization echoed terminology from Augustus's own journals, terms no mainstream medical research had ever used. According to these logs, the firm had been subcontracted by a third party with no formal name, only a symbol, a stylized H intertwined with a serpent. One entry stood out. It read, "Subject C is progressing. Emotional resonance decreasing. Compliance levels at target thresholds. Physical decay halted. Initiating familial imprinting next cycle." Investigators initially dismissed the files as an elaborate hoax. But then, a retired employee, name withheld from all public record, came forward. She claimed she'd worked on a project nicknamed the Still House, a place where no one ever truly died and where 5 preserved bodies were monitored in suspended functionality for nearly 2 decades. Her story was brief and fragmented, but she confirmed the subjects never spoke. They responded to light. They flinched at sound. They required no food, no warmth, only regular chemical injections and careful environmental calibration. She remembered one more detail: the man who oversaw the project. He never gave his name, but the text called him the Father. When she asked him why they did it, he simply said, to keep them close, to keep them from forgetting who they are. Later that year, hikers in the Appalachian Mountains encountered an abandoned greenhouse tucked in a ravine. Inside, rows of potted plants had long withered. But beneath the greenhouse floor, in a concealed trap door, authorities discovered something more sinister, an underground chamber. 5 chairs, 5 names etched into the wall: Augustus, Eleanor, Jonathan, Caroline, Samuel. The air inside was sterile and cold, preserved by some kind of geothermal cooling system. Along the back wall was a bank of monitors and nutrient infusion equipment, all of it long since deactivated. There were no bodies this time, no journals, only a single line of text written across the wall in charcoal. "This is not the end. We are only waiting for the world to slow down." What that meant, no one could say. But a theory began to spread. The Hargraves weren't just fleeing from attention. They were preparing for something, some kind of long-term stasis. A plan that would allow them to emerge into a different kind of future. One where their condition wouldn't seem unnatural. One where humanity had blurred the line between life and death enough for their existence to be normalized. A few believed that future had already begun. Around the same time, a series of unexplained break-ins occurred at cryogenics labs across the U.S. But nothing was stolen, at least nothing physical. Instead, data servers were accessed. Research logs were copied. Surveillance footage was wiped. In every case, security teams reported seeing a tall man on camera, always dressed in black, his face turned from the lens. And always, at the edge of each frame, barely visible, 4 motionless figures standing just behind him. The same configuration, the same impossible stillness. A family watching the world from the shadows, waiting, adapting, and perhaps planning to step forward once more. The thought that the Hargraves were preparing for a future where they no longer needed to hide sent a ripple through the small but growing network of those who studied them. If they were integrating into modern scientific spaces, learning from cryogenics, harvesting data, adapting protocols, then they weren't just reacting anymore. They were evolving. And then came the most disturbing lead of all. In early 2023, a cryptic post appeared on a fringe forum for abandoned architecture. It was quickly deleted, but not before several users captured screenshots. The post featured a series of grainy photos showing the interior of what looked like a long-forgotten fallout shelter beneath an abandoned hospital in upstate New York. The images showed 5 reclining chairs arranged in a circle, surrounded by medical equipment retrofitted with unfamiliar tubing and faded handwritten labels. On one wall, a massive yellow diagram was tacked up. Anatomical sketches, blood flow patterns, and something labeled retention loop integrity. One photo showed a small nameplate screwed into the wall near the entrance. Property of the Hargrave Institute for Reconstructive Cognition. No such institute exists on record. There are no business licenses, no tax records, no online references. But the handwriting on the wall diagrams matched that of Augustus's known journal entries, and one chilling detail stood out. Each reclining chair had a nameplate of its own, the same 5 names as always. But this time, something had changed. Beneath each name was a date, not birth dates, not dates of death. Reactivation cycles: March 3, 2009, June 27, 2015, October 12, 2022. These weren't just preserved bodies anymore. They were being brought back online, periodically, intentionally. Not to live, not to die, but to remain. The Hargraves had become something else entirely, not quite human, not quite machine. Their flesh was real, but their life was borrowed, extended in short pulses, maintained like aging machinery. The keepers, whoever they now were, had learned to reawaken them, calibrate their faculties, and reset the process before the mind degraded. It was no longer about escaping death. It was about becoming part of a system, a loop, a tradition that no longer needed to justify itself with grief or memory, just function. One researcher, a former mortuary pathologist who had quietly studied the Hargrave myth for decades, summed it up in one phrase: they're no longer preserving the dead. They're preserving identity. The shell doesn't matter anymore. Only the pattern. In other words, the Hargraves had turned themselves into echoes, ghosts with structure, bodies with just enough awareness to recognize each other. Rituals held them together, meals never eaten, books never finished, songs never sung, just the rhythm of what used to be life. And yet, there was something darker still. Because if the keepers had truly perfected this process, if they could now replicate it from scratch, then Augustus's legacy might not be limited to just his family. They could make more. They could create new familial units, not by birth, not by adoption, but by selection, by reconstruction, by imitation, the perfect family, made immortal through repetition. 5 roles, 5 functions: father, mother, daughter, son. And the quiet observer, the boy who never speaks, never grows, never questions. And somewhere behind them all, the new father watches. He prepares the chemicals, he monitors the decay, he chooses the next vessel when one begins to fail. And slowly, with precision, the procession continues. Across continents, through decades, into cities, through woods, always 5, always watching, always waiting for someone to come too close. Because this isn't a ghost story anymore. This is a blueprint, a ritual turned procedure. And wherever they are now, they aren't hiding from the world. They're practicing how to live in it. There's a disturbing clarity to the idea that the Hargraves are no longer bound by mortality, but by tradition. Not just a family, but a formula. 5 figures in perpetual stasis. Not because they couldn't move on, but because they refused to let go of the pattern they'd built. And now, others were being brought into that pattern. Recruited, molded, or worse, engineered. Reports began surfacing of isolated communities that seemed to follow eerily similar behaviors. In northern Montana, a ranger stumbled upon a remote homestead surrounded by barbed fencing and floodlights that only operated at night. Inside the compound, 5 residents lived in absolute silence. They moved only when guided. They ate without chewing, their eyes never quite aligned with the people around them. Local officials tried to investigate, but by the time they arrived with warrants, the property had been stripped. Floors ripped out, walls gutted, the basement filled with quicklime and sawdust. The 5 were gone. But among the debris, a single journal remained, its pages soaked, torn, but partially legible. Inside were entries detailing routine maintenance of the units, with references to dosage schedules, muscle stimulation therapy, and behavioral reinforcement through repetition of familial rituals. The cover bore the initials A.H. The cycle had begun to repeat, now far beyond one bloodline. The Hargrave method, once hidden in the stone halls of Ravenwood, was being exported, duplicated, disseminated in fragments, spread across continents by those who had glimpsed the ritual and couldn't look away, by those who didn't want to let go of the dead, or themselves. And then came the final confirmation that this legacy had reached full control. A tech contractor in Silicon Valley was hired to restore encrypted drives recovered from a demolished research facility in Nevada. The facility had burned, no official record of its tenants remained, and no public explanation was offered. But what the contractor found on those drives shook him to the core. Blueprints, not just for preserving bodies, but for preparing replacements. Schematics for synthetic organs. Instructional diagrams for artificial musculature reinforced by biochemical preservation. A list of names with notes beside each. Initial subject, stable. Successor vessel prepared. Cognitive mimicry. 92% retention. At the bottom of one folder was a file named simply Family 5XE. The program launched a 3D rendering of 5 human forms. As the model rotated, annotations appeared, each with a designation. Paternal, status, locked maternal, status, stable elder son, status, minor degradation, daughter, status, vocality, lost young son, status, vessel needed. It wasn't just that the Hargraves were surviving, they were selecting, they were replacing, and more chillingly, they had already anticipated the eventual failure of their own bodies. The keeper, or perhaps now the engineer, had adapted the methodology beyond the flesh. The original bodies may still exist, stored and preserved like relics, but the family had become modular, transferable, ghosts inside pre-programmed rituals. One of the final files on the drive contained video logs. Only one was intact. Dated January 4th, 2023, it showed a dimly lit room. A man stood in the corner, speaking in a low, deliberate voice. 4 figures sat at a table in front of him, unmoving, waiting. His voice cracked as he whispered, "She's ready. Charlotte will wake again. I've stabilized the vocal cords. I've slowed the degradation." Then he turned to the camera, his face gaunt, eyes wide with belief. "She won't even know she was gone." He smiled. Behind him, one of the figures twitched and blinked. The screen went dark. That single blink, captured on corrupted video from a scorched facility, reverberated through the few circles still daring to track the Hargraves. If Charlotte, preserved since 1803, chemically sustained through centuries of degradation, could blink, then everything changed. It wasn't just theory anymore. It wasn't folklore. It was functioning, and worse, it was progressing. Soon after that video surfaced, a new pattern of sightings emerged. All quiet, all unconfirmed, all disturbingly similar. In rural Vermont, a groundskeeper reported seeing 5 people standing motionless outside an abandoned church hours before dawn. By the time he returned with others, the figures were gone. But inside the church, they found 5 chairs arranged in a semicircle around the altar, and on the wall behind them the phrase, "We remember who we are." In southern Oregon, a traveling nurse claimed she was hired for a private job assisting with homebound care in a heavily secured mansion outside Grants Pass. She only lasted 3 days. In her official resignation statement, filed quietly with the local agency, she wrote, "They don't talk, they don't sleep, they just sit in the exact same places, waiting for the man to enter the room. When he speaks, they twitch. They turn their heads, slow, mechanical, like they're hearing something from far away. I don't know if they're alive. I just know they're not dead." And in the Nevada desert, drone footage captured by a conspiracy-focused filmmaker revealed a small complex deep in restricted territory. 5 figures stood beside a tall man in a black coat, unmoving in the midday sun. The footage was removed within hours. The uploader was never seen online again. For those who followed the Hargraves for generations, these weren't isolated events. They were check-ins, brief windows into a machinery still grinding beneath the surface of the world. A machine powered not by electricity or science, but by obsession, devotion, ritual repetition so deep it had begun to overwrite biology. The keepers had gone far beyond preservation. They had cracked replication, which raised a final, terrifying possibility. What if the figures we now see aren't even the originals anymore? What if Augustus, Eleanor, Jonathan, Carolyn, and Samuel have long since broken down, buried in secret chambers beneath ash and stone, and what remains are facsimiles? Each generation built not from cells, but from design. A family reconstructed from memory, instruction, and function. Because the roles must always be filled. The seated mother, the quiet father, the stiff children, and the boy who never speaks, never grows, and always stands behind the others. Witnesses described that 5th figure as the most unsettling of all, not for what he did, but for what he didn't. He never moved independently. He never interacted. But whenever people returned to the site, his position had changed, as if he were always last to be reset, always last to be moved. Perhaps a failsafe, perhaps the start of a new generation, and maybe that's the true horror. Not that the Hargraves refused to bury their dead, but that they discovered a way to become something that no longer needed burial, no longer needed rest, just periodic reassembly, like a haunted melody endlessly played. The same 5 chords repeated over and over, slightly off-key, slightly decayed, but always recognizable. And somewhere, right now, in a room that smells of chemicals and silence, a new Charlotte is blinking. A new Samuel is twitching. A new Eleanor is being lifted gently into her chair, because the family must be complete, Because death was never an ending, it was an inconvenience, one that Augustus Hargrave solved long ago. And the rest of us, we've just been catching up. And maybe that's what makes the story of the Hargraves so terrifying. Not the experiments, the bodies, or even the blinking, but the permanence, the insistence that nothing ends. Not love, not loss, not the family ritual. That if you cling hard enough to the roles, to the routine, to the illusion of togetherness, you can outlast death itself. Even now, there are reports. A hiker in the Smoky Mountains found a clearing where the trees had been flattened in a perfect circle. In the center, 5 indentations in the soil, shaped like chairs. No tracks, no wildlife nearby, just silence and the smell of old antiseptic. A family vacationing in New Mexico reported that, while driving a remote desert road, their car broke down near an old structure. The father walked toward it, hoping to find help, and swore he saw a man watching him from inside. Behind him stood 4 others, stiff, still, and so pale they almost glowed under the sun. He never approached. He didn't need to. That night, his daughter woke screaming. She said she dreamed of sitting at a dinner table, unable to move, while 4 others stared silently at her, waiting for someone to say grace. And perhaps the most disturbing story of all came from a real estate agent in northern Michigan. She had been tasked with selling a lake house that had sat untouched for years. When she entered, everything was immaculate, dustless, color-coded, untouched by time. In the living room sat 5 chairs, arranged to face each other. A framed photo sat on the fireplace mantel. It showed 5 figures, no faces, just silhouettes, their backs to the camera. On the back of the photo, in perfectly neat cursive, was a single line: "Don't turn them around." She didn't finish the tour. The house burned to the ground 2 weeks later. Arson was suspected, but no suspects were ever found, and so the legend endures. Some say the Hargraves are immortal. Others believe they've passed their process to underground cults or sold it to clandestine biotech firms. A few whisper that they've spread like a virus. 5 roles repeated again and again, hidden in towns, forests, basements, always silent, always seated, always watching. The world may never know the full truth, but their story survives for one reason. Because it's believable. Because we've all wanted, at some point, to stop time. To hold on to the ones we love just a little longer. To freeze the moment before it's lost. To create something that can't die, even if it means it can never truly live again. Augustus Hargrave did what so many feared to even imagine. He refused to grieve. And instead, he built a legacy not out of memories, but out of flesh, chemicals, and repetition. And in doing so, he left behind something that walks the edge of science and horror. Something that won't rot, won't weep, won't age, but also won't rest. So if, one night, you find yourself in an unfamiliar town and you pass a window that reveals 5 figures sitting perfectly still in a candlelit room, don't stop. Don't stare. And whatever you do, don't go knocking to ask who lives there, because the door might open, and 5 eyes might turn toward you all at once. And the man at the center might simply smile and say, "We've been waiting for you. One of ours is failing, and the family must remain whole."